changes now. Could spend a lifetime trying to figure it out. I'm going through changes now.
Thank you all for joining our first of our monthly SWISLR webinars. This is our third year of our SWISLR RCN, so I'm really excited to bring you our third year of our SWISLR webinars. And this year we really want to focus on kind of what projects have happened, highlight what we've learned since we started to define these key questions of saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. And so up first, we have our theme of who is engaged and who is excluded in risk prevention, climate adaptation, and SWISLR mitigation. And so to answer this theme and start thinking about what we know, what we don't know, and what we could know in the future, we have a few people here to help us. First, we have a Zoom room full of saltwater intrusion and sea level rise experts. So please engage in the question and answer at the end of each of these presentations and write any comments you have in the Zoom chat function. And we can get to that discussion at the end of the Zoom call. Then we also have Meg Perry and Dr. Karen McGlathery here to talk to us about their projects. We'll first have Meg Perry talk about their project, and then Dr. Karen McGlathery at the end talk about hers. So up first is Meg Perry. She is a facilitator and stakeholder engagement specialist at the SWCA Environmental Consultants Group. She has been working with the Resilient Coastal Communities program in North Carolina, and today she will talk to us about this rural coastal community challenges and what she has learned in her work with them. Take it away, Meg.
Thank you, Kira, and thanks everyone. It's great to be with this group and excited to learn a little bit more about what you all are doing with the invitation to speak to you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Yes, so I am partway through several different community engagement efforts on the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula, and so I'm going to kind of give you a report out of how that's going and what I'm seeing and hearing as we're going through these processes. So I'll give you an overview of the three specific planning efforts that I've been involved in Washington and Terrell counties. So let me hear you say Tyrell, it's Terrell. I'll explain a little bit about our methods, how we've been listening to community voices through those processes, and what I'm hearing and seeing. I'm going to speak for myself today. I'm part of collaborative teams on all of these projects, and I'm not speaking for the whole group, but really just sharing my observations of what I'm hearing and seeing through these processes, what I'm not hearing and seeing, and some lessons and needs that stand out to me having gone through these processes so far. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about imagining positive outcomes and what those might look like. So just a very quick introduction to this region for those who may not be very familiar. This is a large area of land. Had trouble finding an exact size, but roughly the size of Delaware, this peninsula in eastern North Carolina, just inside the Outer Banks. So the larger square here shows the whole peninsula, and then I've been working specifically in Washington and Terrell counties on the northern coast along the Albemarle Sound. This is a rural, as you can see, very low-lying set of counties in eastern North Carolina. A lot of land is in forestry. A significant amount of land is also in agriculture. There's a history of ditching and draining, so a lot of ditches, very, very large ditches to the point of being more like canals that move water through this land. And it's also an area that has a lot of different jurisdictions in play. So there's federal land in the National Wildlife Refuge. There's State Wildlife Resources Commission and state park lands in these counties as well, which just makes for especially complex stakeholder engagement and community outreach. So just a quick overview of these 3 planning efforts that I've been involved in. The first is the North Carolina Resilient Coastal Communities Program that Kara mentioned at the top. This is administered through the Division of Coastal Management here in North Carolina. And it really is focused on providing technical assistance to coastal counties and towns to conduct coastal hazard risk assessment and identify and pursue projects that would help make these communities more resilient to coastal hazards. So we've worked with 6 communities now since the beginning of the program. And in this most recent round, worked with Washington County and the town of Cresswell, which is in Washington County. And in that process, the Division of Coastal Management does sort of a matchmaking to link consultants to communities. And so we were paired with Washington County. The second process that's ongoing is the Scuppernong Water Management Study. This is a very collaborative process that's been sort of loosely led by the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership in both Washington and Terrell counties, because the Scuppernong River watershed encompasses both parts of both counties. That is kind of midstream right now, and at the point that we've done some community engagement, and we're now awaiting engineering modeling results, which we will then bring back to the community to help them understand their water management system better and what options they might have to reduce flooding impacts going forward. And then the third process, I've been supporting Audubon, North Carolina with stakeholder engagement in Northern Terrell County. They have some NOAA funding to do community co-creation of nature-based solutions in that region. So again, there's some overlap with the Scuppernong Water Management Study, and then being adjacent to Washington County, where we worked on the RCCP process. And that is still somewhat early stage. We've done some initial community engagement. We did a community listening session about a month ago, and we're just starting to transition from listening and learning about what community concerns are to starting to frame up an ask for some engineering information, some modeling, and I'll talk more about kind of what we're learning from that process so far. So all at slightly different stages, slightly different geographies, but really have been having a chance to get to know this communities in these 2 counties pretty intensively over the last couple of years. So what has our engagement and listening looked like so far? A lot of different strategies. Between these 3 different projects, we've had the opportunity to have steering committees and community action teams, is what they're called under the Resilient Coastal Communities Program. So those are groups of leaders and decision makers in each community that are meeting regularly to contribute to these planning processes and help guide the teams as far as how we reach out to the wider community. We've done open house events with interactive opportunities for input, like this poster here, where people shared things that they value about the Scuppernong River. They also provided input on collaborative maps to identify areas of flooding concern. We've done community listening sessions where we're really just trying to gather initial information and understanding of what community concerns might be. We've gone out to community groups and governing bodies to present on these planning processes and discuss with those entities what we're working on and what they might like us to know. And we've had some more general presence in the community through parades and festivals. So this picture up on the right, I was in the town of Cresswell for their Christmas parade last year. And again, just talking with folks about what kind of flooding issues they see in their community and getting to know some of those local decision makers and leaders who have a role to play in planning and implementing. We've done surveys, both online and hard copy, with mixed results. A lot of these rural communities especially don't engage a lot online. Even email sometimes is not very effective, and I'm mostly calling or texting people. But have still gotten some good information through those surveys, and particularly the Scuppernong study was able to gather some site-specific information about flooding, areas of flooding concern that we then, with the help of Laura Eddy at Nature Conservancy, were able to synthesize into one digital map that documented those areas that stakeholders had identified. We've also done site visits with local knowledge holders. So actually getting out on the ground, looking at the town pump station, looking at the ditches, having the people who are managing those systems or living with those systems show us live and in person what's going on. And then lots of individual outreach for information and expertise, and kind of keeping people bought in throughout the planning process. So that's an overview of how we've been going about these engagement processes. Lots of different strategies combined. So some things that I'm hearing, and then again, speaking from my perspective and understanding that these processes are midway through, and in the scale of getting to know community, I'm still very early stage, having been working in these communities for a couple of years. So that's just a caveat to say, I'm sure I still have a lot to learn and may not have a complete understanding of all the issues. But in general, things that I'm hearing people say directly, things are getting worse. My yard is constantly wet, roads flood regularly, ditches are almost always full to the brim, trees are dying. People are seeing that and they're expressing concern about it. Another thing we hear a lot is they made things worse. And I emphasize the they there because it means a lot of different things in different sentences. Sometimes it means a particular individual. Sometimes it's talking about a particular agency or landowner. But it's an important pattern I've noticed, because to me, it speaks of lack of clarity on exactly who is responsible for what decisions. And folks are concerned and they're looking for someone to take responsibility, but it's not always clear who that should be. Cleaning out the ditches is always the go-to solution that we hear. And there's been a mixed history in a lot of these areas where maintenance was happening. There have been different entities responsible for maintaining ditches in different places at different times. But there's a general perception that cleaning out the ditches has not been happening recently the way that it used to, and that's part of what's causing more flooding than in the past. So there's just been a focus on that one familiar solution, which may be an important piece of the puzzle. But part of what we've been learning is, we may need to do some additional outreach and learning together about what other solutions might be helpful. Conservation versus people, there's bad history in this area between conservation efforts and local communities. Red wolves, this headline here just earlier this year, continue to be a contentious issue, and there's just a lack of trust between local community members and conservation interests, agencies, organizations because of that history across several issues. And then local power dynamics and racial dynamics continue to influence access and trust. There's ongoing tensions around who has power, how the legacies of racism continue to play out in these communities. And so that's just still very much alive. Some things that I'm seeing, and I distinguish here between hearing and seeing, because these are things that I'm noticing that people don't necessarily directly express. There's not very much broader consensus about what the issues are. I think individuals and small groups have a shared understanding, but there's not a general consensus that this is the challenge we're facing. I don't hear people being able to articulate that very well. There's a general lack of communication and coordination between all these entities. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning about how many jurisdictions come together in this area, there's a lot of coordination needed, and it's not always happening. And a big part of that is lack of capacity. You have very few people managing a very large amount of land. And so local governments, nonprofits don't always have the staff to engage in some of this coordination or to access and manage available funding. And that's been especially challenging recently, where in the past it was about not having enough funding. Now there's all this resilience funding available, but not the staff to go about accessing it and managing it. Another thing I'm seeing is just kind of overall lack of momentum on some of these issues that I don't fully understand yet. I'm still exploring what the sources of that are. And a question I'm holding is trying to understand who's benefiting from the way the system operates currently. Because I think that would be helpful to understand the dynamics of what's going on. Some things that I'm not hearing and seeing, I'm not hearing climate change isn't real. I think we've had some back and forth at the state level about whether we're, quote unquote, allowed to talk about climate change. Whether or not folks are calling it climate change, going back to what I said, people are saying things are getting worse. We're having these crazy rainstorms, we're having droughts. So the folks are seeing those changes happening. Not a lot of really long-term thinking. 5 to 10 years feels like a bit of a stretch. So not much multi-decade scale thinking and planning. As I sort of referenced in the previous slide, there's not a shared understanding of how these water management systems function, or even a full individual understanding. So these are very complex water management systems, and I don't think anybody fully understands how they're really operating, which makes things challenging. Likewise, I don't think anyone fully understands the roles and responsibilities across jurisdictions, who's responsible for what when it comes to how water moves across the landscape. And I think because of that lack of shared understanding and struggle to have enough coordination, I don't see a sense of local empowerment to solve these problems together, or that sort of what I would call a collective stewardship mindset. Like, these are our shared resources, how can we manage them together? So that's kind of what I'm observing so far. And I'll just run through a few lessons and needs based on what my experience has been to date. Some useful approaches that probably won't surprise you. Go slow to go fast. It really takes time to fully understand the context in any given location. And if you want to find good lasting solutions, you need to understand that context. And if you don't have much time, then you need more people who have had that time to understand the context on your team. Working with local champions who have energy and motivation and local knowledge has been incredibly crucial for all of these efforts. And it's important to understand that those individuals don't represent everyone in the community. You can't have just one local champion, go with whatever they say and assume that they know everything about everyone. Integrating lived experience and local expertise is really important. It's not enough to just have your engineers or your researchers go out and look at things from a science standpoint. There's also local expertise that's going to come in, and especially when it comes to understanding the history of a system, how it has been working and why, that lived experience is really important. And as I mentioned, even locals may not fully understand how some of these complex systems are operating. Honoring a multiplicity of perspectives, that's the reason for this elephant here. You're probably familiar with the classic analogy of multiple blind people touching different parts of an elephant, and one person's like, it's like a thin leaf, and another person says, no, it's like a tree, it's got a big trunk. So just a reminder that anytime we're talking about the community, that's never monolithic. There's always a very wide range of perspectives and experiences included in that, and sort of different windows into the same room, right? They're all looking at and experiencing this water management and ecosystem management system, but in different ways with different perspectives. And it's really important to understand that range. And then showing up and building trust by being a true partner. There's a bad history and legacy of research and consultants like myself being, parachuting in and then disappearing again when their objectives are met. So really finding ways to be committed to continue showing up for the long term. And one important piece of that is being a bridge. I can't answer every question or solve every problem, but I can help find the right person who could. And so helping to bridge from these communities to outside resources is a really important role. All right, I'm going to try to go quickly because I hope we have a little time for questions and discussion. Practical needs that I'm seeing: clear shared description of current systems. And again, these practical needs, I think, are things that folks in this network may have an opportunity to help address. So clear shared description of current systems, clear explanations of when and why things happen and how solutions would or would not work. So this is an example, this photo, where a lot of people in this area had been asking about, well, couldn't we dredge the Scuppernong River to help reduce flooding? And so we created this visual to specifically address that question. And the fact that because it's connected to the Albemarle Sound, when you dredge the bottom of the river, it essentially just allows more water from the sound to come in rather than reducing flooding upstream. More face time across jurisdictions and levels of management and responsibility. We've just, wherever we could, created those opportunities, say for county staff, town staff, to all get together in one room and coordinate on things. And that's something that doesn't always happen. And then helping people to access and manage information and resources, going back to that capacity challenge. And then finally, just my thoughts on imagining some positive outcomes for these processes. And this is more kind of big picture, my own big picture thinking about what the potential for these types of project is. Some positive outcomes could be living with water for the long term, understanding that these are low-lying areas that will continue to be impacted by coastal hazards. What would we like living with water to look like? There's a lot of different ways that could look. Collaborative stewardship. What do we need to coordinate effectively? Might be a question that we bring to communities to talk about. How do we keep adapting and learning and planning ahead as these changes continue to happen? Taking ownership of change. What would we like to proactively change on our own terms? And then this is a tricky one because it very much goes against human nature, I think, but using disasters as opportunities for positive changes. So thinking ahead about what places we would like to transform next time they're impacted by a disaster. So these are the kinds of things that I'm hoping as these processes continue, that we can start to help and support communities to think about and work toward together. So, quick rundown of what I'm seeing and learning. It looks like we might have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has them, and then we'll shift over to Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Meg, for going through all of that, and that was really great. I'm clapping. And if anybody has any questions, you can either raise your hand and unmute and ask them, or you can put it in the chat and I can read it out or call on you as well. And it looks like, Paul, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is really helpful information. So Paul Ulanch from the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, and we're partnering with a large coalition of people submitting an application to the NSF Regional Innovation Engine on this particular topic to identify and hopefully implement solutions that solve some of these problems. So Meg, I really appreciate this because it gives great context from a community viewpoint of, if solutions are implemented, what does that really mean? And I think it really fits into your recommended perspective of how to make sure communities are engaged. So I have a few questions. My first one is, so since your focus is a snapshot of these two counties, do you feel that the outcomes and the findings you were getting are more representative of a more larger regional geography? And I ask that because this engine application will include Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Northern North Carolina stakeholders.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Paul. I'm gonna say yes and no. So I think there are definitely aspects of this that would be applicable to any of those coastal communities, in terms of capacity challenges, some of the shift in the funding landscape and communities' ability to manage that funding that's coming down. Where there are some of the same jurisdictional challenges, like having federal and state-owned lands alongside private and individually held lands, some of these same dynamics would come into play. But I always have to say this is super context dependent, and there's absolutely no replacement for spending some time in each community and really researching and talking to people to understand the specifics of that location.
No, thank you, because that's a very good perspective. My last question then, it really is, will the results of your findings or the content you just provided be published somehow that we could utilize as a reference, as a starting point for how best practices for gathering this type of data? Because I think this would be imperative for including in our application. Thanks for this.
Yeah. So probably the place that you're going to see it most likely would be coming out of the Scuppernong Water Management Study. I don't know what the time frame for your application is, and I'm happy to chat offline if there's anything I can do to support in the near term. But that Scuppernong study in the next year or so will be reporting out on lessons learned in relation to community engagement and recommending best practices for similar efforts. So that would be one to watch over the next, probably around this time next year, we might have kind of the final report out from that.
Great, thank you, Meg. Is there any other questions before we get on to the next speaker? Not seeing any, I will start moving on, and of course we can always ask more questions at the end. But up next we have Dr. Karen McGlathery. She's an environmental science professor at the University of Virginia. She is the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute and is a primary researcher for the Eastern Shore of Virginia Climate Equity Project. And her research focuses on the dynamics of ecosystem change, and today she will be talking about her work building capacity for climate adaptation in rural coastal communities. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kara. I'll share my slides. Thank you all for having me. And Meg, thank you very much for going first, because you'll notice that there are a lot of parallels in our presentations and how we're going about doing things and what we're finding. So I really appreciate all that you've said so far. So I'm going to be talking about this NSF-funded COPE project from the Coast and People program, focused on climate equity on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, also a very rural coastal community, and also thinking about building capacity. And this is a big team, interdisciplinary team project. I'm the lead PI, but the work is just involving a lot of people. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the place and the project, and then I'm going to focus in on the community engagement aspect of it. So this is Aerial view of Cape Charles, Virginia, on the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula. It's flat landscape, just like what you all have been working on. And it's very rural. The average population density is between 6 and 10 people per square kilometer, and it's actually declining. And there are many people that are from traditionally underrepresented groups. The 2018 survey census showed that 40% of children lived in poverty. There are 2 counties in this on the peninsula. And like a lot of coastal rural communities, they're disproportionately impacted by the twin effects of climate change, sea level rise, and storm flooding. Like Virginia, like North Carolina, Virginia is a hotspot of both. And what Meg talked about was lack of coordination, jurisdictional challenges, geographic, social isolation, lack of capacity. All those things also are really challenging for the Eastern Shore. And these are just some pictures showing road washout, road flooding, flooding of people's yards, saltwater intrusion, and wetland migration, and creating ghost forests. And the highest point on the Eastern Shore is the Route 13, which is what we call the Continental Divide. Everything to the east flows into the coastal lagoons, everything to the west flows into the Chesapeake Bay. But it's only 15 meters above sea level. So any small change in sea level rise or storm surge is going to have a big impact on the region. And so we're addressing this challenge by co-producing what we are calling a climate equity atlas. Essentially, it's a decision support platform, data visualization, and information presentation for communities to address what the risks are, vulnerabilities, to think about what the outcomes would be of different adaptation solutions. And you'll hear, I'll talk a bit about our co-production process, but essentially what we're doing is we involve communities, the community, and particularly community leaders, in every aspect of the work that we're doing, from the very beginning through to the very end. So it's really a two-way interaction throughout the whole project. And so, like Meg was saying, we're really focusing on integrating our academic knowledge with lived experience. And one of the things that is, I think, at least to me, is unusual about this project is that we have 2 community leaders, shown here, Andre Elliott and Karen Downing, who are on the project leadership team. So we have 4 cover page PIs on the NSF project, and Andre and Karen are with those 4 to direct the project. And so they're our main connection to the community throughout every aspect of the project. And they're not scientists, they're not working for a nonprofit, they're not working for a planning district. They're just local influencers and change makers. So Karen is with Virginia Organizing and a pastor in the Baptist Church, and Andre is the director of the YMCA. And so Andre and Karen have helped us create a community advisory committee that includes key anchor institutions that focus on bringing a diversity of voices to the table. And of course, there is the planning district and the Chamber of Commerce, but notice also there's the health department, the United Way, the community college, the local schools, the area agency on aging. So we're really trying to bring different voices to the table that might not otherwise be there. And one thing I want to point out before I talk about how we're doing it is that we pay people, we compensate these folks for their time and effort. And so this was a protocol established by UVA's Equity Center. Our community co-PIs, we pay them $5,000 a year for their work. And our community advisory committee members, there are a dozen of them, we pay them $550, again, for their work. They meet quarterly, virtually, and then we have a couple of in-person meetings a year. And so this is sort of the conceptual framework of the project. On the left side, you see sort of the guts of what is behind this data, a visualization tool, the Climate Equity Atlas. We integrate social data, we integrate data and models on saltwater intrusion and storm surge, so groundwater models and storm surge models that are spatially explicit. And we also talk a little bit about how we use social network analysis to understand how information is flowing, who's making decisions based on the data, these layers of data that we show. And so We will have this data visualization tool that shows current conditions and conditions moving forward at 20-year intervals in the future with different scenarios of climate change. But also we're using this to look at outcomes of different adaptation strategies. And I want to pause just 1 second so I don't forget to say it, but you'll see when I show you a sort of little video of the prototype. These are right now in census block groups. Those are good to the point that they prevent privacy. They don't infringement, so that a person who has a certain piece of land that might have a great risk of flooding, their privacy is not exposed. But they're not so good for decision making. So we're working on what level of aggregation we're going to use for the data, whether or not it needs to be behind a password protected sort of barrier. So that's just a data ethics issue. That's something that needs to be always thought about when we use these data visualization tools. And so again, we're focusing on groundwater models, looking at groundwater levels, depth to groundwater, and also salinity across the peninsula, and also in specific watersheds, and also storm surge modeling. And this is just a graphic we put together, our team put together, to convey sort of the content of what we're doing with different community members. And the groundwater is a sole source groundwater. So all of the drinking water, all the agricultural water for irrigation comes from the sole source aquifer. And so I'm just gonna play this short video, and it's narrated by Michelle Claiborne at the Equity Center, who is the main architect. And she'll talk about, this is just a prototype. This is just showing a single storm, Hurricane Isabel, and also just showing how we are developing this atlas.
The current version of the Climate Equity Atlas is the first iteration where we start exploring ways of presenting the outcomes generated by the science and engineering teams. Here, we have storm surge simulations based on multiple events, Hurricane Isabel and king tides, with contemporary estimates and projected outcomes for 2050. While the underlying models generate data at higher spatial resolution, here we're aggregating those outcomes to the census block group level, summarized in multiple ways. The maximum surge height in the area, the peak surge, the average surge height across the area, the mean surge, and the percent of the area inundated by a storm surge. For a selected scenario, each available measure is provided by the block group, identified by community-created names, in the heat grid for easy comparison. And the selected measure is displayed on the map. For more localized focal sites, we're exploring ways of sharing outcomes at a higher resolution. Here again, we have storm surge simulations for Hurricane Isabel, both in 2003 and projected for 2050 for Willis Ward, with multiple outcomes available. And we can zoom in to see more detail of the area and the measures. To see the intersection of community impacts and community populations, the aggregated climate measures are graphed alongside community population characteristics. This makes existing patterns more evident and highlights communities with both relatively high climate impacts and greater concentrations of resident characteristics that historically limit resiliency. Here we see that the current version.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Just talk about how we're using this this atlas and how we're engaging with communities to use this atlas. So one of the things we're doing is, as I mentioned, a stakeholder network analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about how we co-produce that with communities, and also using that to develop agent-based models where we can simulate decisions and outcomes in the atlas. So before I talk about the details of how we're doing it, and very much similar to how Meg discussed, I wanted to just highlight the two things that have come out so far that have modified our research. One is as I mentioned, our focus was initially on storm surge, flooding, and saltwater intrusion. We, from the community, heard that increased rainfall was really important in inland flooding. how it affected mobility and road washouts, and also the effects of groundwater levels on failing septic systems. And so here's sort of the alchemy of how we're working with communities. We have interactive workshops, started once a year. Now the community is asking us to do it more often. We do it twice a year. And we also have focus groups, community events, and youth engagement. So our community workshops have been so far kind of like a science fair, where there are different stations addressing where we ask for input on specific questions that you can see here. Threats to septic systems, what are they worried about? What are they seeing? How do they want to contribute? What resources are already here? What are needed? And some of the priorities that were identified by the Climate Equity Atlas were, as you could expect, the effects of sea level rise and flooding, but added to this was intense rainfall, effects of salinization in soils and groundwater, but added to this from the community were septic systems. And then thinking about what the community can do to adapt and mitigate, and how to get the most of the voices, the most voices we can at the table. The number 5 of creating affordable retrofitting houses. This sort of goes to what Meg was saying, that we don't have the answers to this. This is outside the purview of this project, although we do bring resources to the community where they can begin to think about this. And so each workshop builds on the next one, and here's some of the feedbacks. The people have little sticky notes with their number on, and they can answer questions like, do you want to join a focus group? Do you want to be interviewed? Do you want to be part of a science team? How do you want to hear from us? Through internet, Facebook, website, listserv, surveys. And these are just a snapshot of the responses that we get from the communities. And then these feed into our work moving forward. And so we have focus groups. The people who come to the focus groups are recommended by our community advisory committee, and also those who sign up at the workshops. We do coding and content analysis so that topics can emerge that we're hearing from the community. And again, we compensate participants for participating in the focus groups. And so, again, similar to what Meg was saying, we participate in the community events. This is the bottom picture is from Juneteenth. And I'll talk about what they're looking at in a second. It's a historical timeline that we use to sort of ground climate change in a longer perspective. We're also working with Virginia Humanities to do oral histories of different people in the community. We do a lot of institutional interviews. Many of these people are listed here are on our community advisory committee, but from them, we've identified other people. For example, the Eastern Shore Maritime Museum, the Eastern Shore Virginia Barrier Island Center, Historical Center, Citizens for the Better Eastern Shore, which is a nonprofit food bank. So we are doing both individual interviews and institutional interviews. And again, the same kind of content analysis. And so to really get at sort of how is information flowing, who's connected, how to better connect people and build capacity, we started out with this stakeholder analysis where we simply asked people, who are you working with? What organization, what agency, what people? And then we put them on this map with these lines that are connecting them. We bring this to the workshop and people begin to modify it and add to it. And here, as you can see on the left is one of the, this is after the second workshop. And on the right is a community network, a stakeholder network that has been developed from that map. So this is something that we can use to understand information flow. We can use this in our agent-based modeling, but it really gives us a sense of like, how are people connected, how to better connect people to increase planning and resilience. We're also quite involved in the school system. We have an LTER project on the Eastern Shore that has a very well-developed relationship with schools. This is sort of interesting thing that just happened last month. It was a King Tide event, and you can see we worked in collaboration with a lot of organizations and universities. People mapped with spray paint and these iconic white waterman boots where the flooding occurred. We also had students who imagined where the flooding could be when they were, say, they could pick a time, like when they graduated from high school or college. And on the bottom was a sort of fun drumming exercise run by a music professor at UVA, where the students basically took these data on flood days from over the last 40 years and put them to a rhythm and used these very high-tech drums and sticks. And it was actually a pretty enlightening experience for everybody. So I mentioned that history is an important portal in these rural communities that are very much identified with their place, to think about how their environment has changed, what about their environmental history, lived experience, how has this changed from as far back as historical records and maps to their own experience. So some of it is narratives they've heard from their family members. Some of it is their own experience. It could be anything from the Bay Bridge Tunnel being created. It could be when large-scale agriculture started. It could be a particular hurricane. And so this is sort of a living exhibit, I guess, interactive exhibit. Every workshop we put it up and people read and add their sticky notes. So it's actually quite involved right now. And so we make a version of it and fold it up into a pizza box, and we bring it to different organizations as well. So you don't have to come to the workshop to contribute. We also use graphics to communicate with broader community. These are poster size graphics that talk about what sea level rise is, what storm surge is, why we see these ghost forests. That's what's shown here, from saltwater intrusion, how marshes are migrating to forests. This talks about climate equity and different sources of economy and livelihoods on the Eastern Shore. So again, a way to sort of bring these topics to communities, and they're all over the place. They're in libraries, they're in schools, they're in shops, and that's a way that we can socialize the project. And I also just wanted to highlight one of the last things is that we are learning that we have to refine how we're communicating about the project. I don't know if you noticed on the list of institutional interviewees, we don't have anybody from the agricultural community, from the farming community. And one of the things our community advisory committee was saying to us is like, if you really want to get more people involved than who already is involved, you need to think about what you're calling it. That climate change, equity, and Atlas maybe aren't the words that are best to use to get the broadest swath of people involved in this conversation. So we're doing focus groups now about what could we call it instead? Is it a dashboard? Is it a hub? Is it about livability on the Eastern Shore? Is it about just environment and not climate change? And so that's an interesting process. We're all having to like give up the name that we love so much and think about what is best for the community. One thing we have, I mentioned the drumming experience with the King Tide. We also work really closely with the school system and an art teacher. We're finding that youth can be great ambassadors in the community in terms of thinking about these issues. We might not be able to get their grandparents to talk with us, but we can talk with the kids, and the kids want to talk. This is where we shared the themes of the project on sea level rise and saltwater intrusion with the students, asked them to talk to their family and ask them to make a piece of art that reflected what they were hearing. And this is a quote from one of the students about their grandma's overflowing toilet in their bathroom every time there was a high tide, and that they see this happening more often. And so this artwork was at a local business in a show for a pretty long period of time last spring. So it's a way to connect with other folks. And so here's sort of what we're hearing from the community. It's a lot of the same issues that Meg talked about in terms of building capacity, thinking about getting access to funding, having the expertise that can help in some of those funding applications, understanding what the needs are, being a reliable and trusted resource for the community, helping them plan strategies, and making sure that we have the most people at the table and addressing this really important issue of durable septic systems in the region, which again, we had not originally put into our proposal, but we learned from the community was most important to them. And so just sort of some final key messages, that we are integrating the social and environmental data and models to address climate risk and equity, that it has to be reciprocal. It has to be a continuous back and forth with the community. And to really be effective, we have to share power. I don't know if you saw at the community workshops, the people presenting to the community members was not me. It was not any of the PIs. It was Karen and Andre, our community leaders. So they own the project. They're the ones that say, hey, have you guys ever heard about the National Science Foundation? Probably not. But let me tell you, like, they're investing in this place. And let's talk about it. So they're always the face of the project to the community, which is really effective. And they are really committed to the project. Through them, we've really been able to start to build some of these lasting partnerships with the community. And then again, it takes time. It really takes a long time. And Meg, I know, has multi-year projects, but it's not something you can expect to happen quickly. And if you want it to be durable and to last, there's a lot of commitment that needs to be done. And I'm sorry that I'll end now, but I did realize I clicked too quickly on the video. But what I just wanted to point out that the video also maps out data for different regions by population characteristics. So for a certain county, it can say this is the risk, the storm surge risk for people who are predominantly Black, for people who are Hispanic, for people who make under $40,000 a year. So it can connect the social and the environmental data, and that kind of interface we're working pretty hard on right now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Karen, for that presentation. And I think someone just posted in the chat, one of the major questions I had, is that Atlas or Hub publicly accessible yet, or is it still waiting to be published?
Not yet, but it will be soon.
Cool.
And I just to be clear, I mentioned it, but the data ethics issue is a pretty big one. You know, it's like you can do census blocks, which is what we show, but it shows very broad scale patterns across the peninsula, but it doesn't, if you're a landowner, it's not going to help you at all, even if you're a decision maker. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's the right level of data aggregation, and also make sure that our models can feed into that. And so that's a big issue.
Yeah, thank you for acknowledging that big issue as well, because that's something that I think we see a lot in humanities work and working with census blocks and census tracts. Do we have any other questions in the room directly for Karen and her climate equity project before we open it up to everybody? Let's see, we have one from Kevin, and he asks, what is the role of or potential for engaging local to regional elected officials in this work? This could be a question for both, and he's curious if there are already participation with the community meetings or if it's separate from officials.
So we do present at community meetings, and we do work directly with elected officials. However, elected officials change, as we know. And so we find that it's actually more effective to work with their staffers for the longer term. But so we connect with both levels, and we do present at community meetings.
And I do also see that Jen Swenson posted a Shiny app for the Eastern Shore Atlas. So thank you, Jen, for posting that. And Meg also responded that there are local officials on the steering committee for some of the projects.
just to be clear with that Shiny app, that's like
Yeah.
the architecture. It doesn't have all the model data integrated into it yet.
Great, thank you.
Karen, I don't know if I missed this, but how many years has your work been going on in this area?
We're for this particular project, we're in year 3.
I also think that funding is something that keeps coming up with both of your work and things that I have seen along the coast. And I'm curious, I know, Meg, you mentioned that funding is now available, but potentially not enough capacity to access it. And if, Karen, you're seeing that too, that funding is available for the area, but people just aren't accessing it, and how we can potentially move into this area of accessing the funding that is available.
I can just give an example. We have one person in the Planning District Commission for the entire peninsula. And he would have to be, the one person would have to be submitting the application for the entire peninsula, whatever the problem is. And he just can't, right? He just doesn't have the capacity. And so what he's looking to us for is to help him, to provide him with the data and the visualizations and the context to say, this whole community, you know, the groundwater level is like this and their septic systems can't perk, and it's going to look like this in the next 20, 40, 60 years. So we need the money to deal with it now. But he just doesn't have that information. And he also just, yeah, it's a problem because there's only one person, you know, that's a structural problem that we can't change, but we can certainly support it.
Yeah, similar, I would say we see cases where it's just not enough hands or, you know, especially at the town level, there may not be anyone who has grant application or grant management experience or sufficient staff time allocated to manage like a big federal grant or even a state grant. So, and we've had some success. The North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency has been able to support some of these communities to apply for grants and contract with grant management support. So there've been some cases where we've been able to make that connection to help get funding to some of these smaller communities.
I don't know if Jason is still here. His question about, I know Meg answered Jason, but so storm surge flooding and also nuisance sunny day flooding is something we're hearing from the community is really important. We hadn't originally thought about doing nuisance flooding, and that's more important for them these days than a single storm. And so getting these detailed maps showing where that's happening and how it's impacting whether it's their farm field or their backyard or their septic system has become one of the priorities of the project. And that again came from the community.
We have another question in the chat for both speakers. Are people talking about ghost forests and the ghost forest expansion with salinization? And if people are talking about that, what are some of the concerns that people have expressed?
For us, you know, I showed you those two posters. One of them was just about ghost forests. So people definitely see ghost forests as a sentinel of saltwater intrusion. And so it gets their attention. Practically, people, we have ghost forests and marshes, you know, we have that. We see that also as an indicator of saltwater intrusion into fertile agricultural land. And that's kind of really where they're focusing. So the ghost forests are kind of a sentinel, and then they're focusing in on the parallel to the agricultural land, which is a major source of income for the region.
Yeah, similar in the areas I'm working, I would say it's kind of the same.
Well, thank you again for those great presentations, and thank you everyone for joining. We are at the hour mark, so I will cut it off there, but thank you for joining, and I am going to put our SWISLR.org contact us link, and that is one of the ways you can join our newsletter, which will announce not only when the recording from this is available, but also will announce any future webinars that we'll have in the future, because I'm very excited for our next one that will be talking about ecosystem change at a large scale, specifically talking about how ecosystem modeling and remote sensing can help us project future trajectories of saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next month.